Hello, Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. This week I review how God answers prayer for Hanna. Hanna is a childless woman in a society that values women with children, and male children in particular. Hanna is distressed, distraught, and discouraged. She faces baby mama drama from her husband's other wife, and she's had about enough of living in this pain. In the end, Hanna's situation works out. God answers her prayer. But for so many people, things don't always work out the way we think they should. Like Hanna, many people are unable to do anything about their circumstances, knowing that only God can work it out. Like Hanna, we rejoice when things do work out. But when life throws us twists and turns, we can be confident that God loves us no less. And in fact, God's love for us is infinite. Hanna didn't know things were going to work out, but after hearing the man of God tell her to go in peace, her soul was no longer troubled. She had a calm assurance that somehow God was still on her side. As we continue to understand how God is faithful, this week I focus on Hanna as she responds to God with calm assurance after promising to give her firstborn child back to God as a Nazirite. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms vows and Nazirite. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom or wherever you share this lesson, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. With Wi-Fi, you can start and stop the lesson when and where you want to for discussion. What I provide is a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. So please subscribe, like, comment, and then click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. As always, first we'll look at the background for today's text. The books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel bear the name of the priest, the judge, and the prophet Samuel. However, Samuel dies before 1 Samuel ends. The New Interpreter Study Bible notes that these two books were originally one book and remain one book in the Jewish canon. The division into two books probably originated in the 2nd century before Christ, or before the Common Era, when the translation of the Hebrew, into Greek. Regardless of whether Samuel is read as one or two books, its major themes remain the same, and they're seen throughout both books. The NISB notes that there are two large and interlocking themes in 1 Samuel. The first large theme is public. It's the importance of good government. The second major theme, which continues in 2 Samuel, is personal. It's the complexity of relationships, both between people and God and among people. Additionally, Nelson's Bible Handbook explains that 1 Samuel records the critical transition in Israel from the rule of God through the judges to God's rule through kings. It also notes that all of 2 Samuel and a major portion of 1 Samuel deal with events that happen after Samuel's death. And this is likely an indication of the importance of Samuel. The reason both of these books are named after Samuel is an indication of the importance of Samuel as a major figure during a transitional time for the Israelites. The NISB notes as a part of the second major theme in Samuel, the complexity of relationships between families. These interhuman relationships are almost always conflicted, beginning with Hanna and Peninnah and going through Eli and his sons, Samuel and his sons, and Saul and his children. Listen, parent-child relationships are a constant concern in all of Samuel. The first chapter of 1 Samuel opens with the story of Samuel's mother, Hanna, and she's praying to conceive a man-child. Hanna, a barren woman, has been tormented by Peninnah, the other wife of Hannah's husband, Elkanah. They have come to Shiloh to offer sacrifices unto the Lord. The text notes that Elkanah gave portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hanna he gave a double portion because he loved her, even though the Lord had closed her womb. The NISB explains that there are three themes in this story. The first is strife within the family. The second is God acting behind the scenes in ways that are apparent only to those who look for such actions. And then thirdly, the third theme is God's penchant for unexpectedly raising up the lowly. The central theme of this week's lesson continues to be God's faithfulness, this time during grief, and that God answers prayer. So the central theme is that God answers prayer even during grief. And in this text, we see a powerless woman beset with family conflict, and we see how God moves on her behalf to answer her prayer. Our text will reveal how Hanna prayed, how God answered, and how Hanna honored God for answering her prayer. One note of caution: please be considerate, knowing that God has not favorably answered the prayer of every woman and every man who desires to have a child. Many women and men struggle for years to have a child only to be disappointed. We know that God is able and that God can change their situation. What we don't know is when or even if God will. So please be considerate when dealing with this topic and dealing with this subject, as Hanna desires to have a child and she prays to God and she gets the blessing of a child. There are many hope to be wishful parents out there who have not had that experience, and it's a burden on their heart. So be considerate as you deal with this lesson. Some important words to consider from this text include the term vows and Nazirite. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. Last week's lesson was taken from Genesis, the 19th chapter. It was titled Faithful During Distress and Faith in Doubt. Verse 1 began with two angels arriving Sodom in the evening. And when Lot sees them, he gets from the gates of Sodom, he gets up and he greets them. The text then skips to verses 4 and 5 and then 15. And I covered verses 2 through 14 as a way to more fully understand the entire story. In verses 2 and 3, Lot invited the angels to spend the night at his house, where he showed them great hospitality by providing shelter and making a feast. Before they fall asleep, all the men of the city, from the young to the old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded, "Bring them out to us so that we may know them." I quoted the NISB's explanation that since we may know them is a veiled reference to sexual intercourse, the men of Sodom would be intent on homosexual relations with Lot's guests. I also quoted the NISB explaining, while Israelite law prohibited sexual relations between men, Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, the narrator here appears more appalled by other aspects of the Sodomites' behavior. This story is particularly critical of the mistreatment of guests and disregard for the inviolable or the unbreakable codes of hospitality, and of their mistreatment of an alien in their midst. This is an instance of the social oppression identified as the city's chief sin in the 18th chapter, verses 20 and 21. I noted that this is a story focused on the punishment of Sodom because of inhospitality toward its guests, as well as its violence toward aliens in their midst. The men of Sodom were evidently seeking to gang rape these guests, and for these transgressions, God would destroy this city. I quoted the New Interpreter's Bible one-volume commentary, noting that the obligation to extend generous hospitality to vulnerable strangers is deeply rooted in Israelite law. Additionally, it notes their intention to have sexual relations with these strangers signals their intention to commit the violent act of male rape, which is a technique of humiliation and torture of vulnerable people, both men and women. And that goes on today. We see that kind of humiliation and torture today. The wickedness of Sodom here is not homosexuality. Sodom's sin is the lack of hospitality and the threatened violence by heterosexual men against vulnerable people in the community, those considered aliens and strangers in their midst. Again, this text is not primarily focused on homosexuality, but more so the violence and inhospitality. Ezekiel 16th chapter verses 48 through 50 explains the sin of Sodom. Ezekiel 16:48 reads, "As I live, says the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. This, here it is, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, listen, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore, I removed them when I saw it." So Lot begs these men to not act so wickedly. Then, surprisingly, he makes the horrible offer to give the men his 2 virgin daughters instead of the 2 guests. Keep in mind that this was a patriarchal society. Women were often, if not always, treated as property. Women had little, if any, rights at all and were treated at best as second-class citizens. The men refused Lot's offer, and they then threaten that they'll deal worse with Lot than they'll do with his guests. The NISB notes that this is a desperate act of a man trying to preserve both his life and the ancient codes of hospitality. But it also reveals the perilous place of women as second-class citizens in ancient society. After these 2 guests rescue Lot by reaching out to bring him in the house and shut the door behind him, the angels strike the men outside the door with blindness. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to take his wife and 2 daughters out of the city so that they would not suffer the same punishment of the city. Lot lingers. The angels seize him. They seized him, his wife, and 2 daughters by the hand and took them outside the city. The text does not say why Lot lingered. Verse 17 told us, when they brought them outside, they said, flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you'll be consumed. These guests are intent on sparing Lot and his family. Verses 18 and 19 show Lot's gratefulness, but they also show his doubt that he could make it to the hills. In verse 20, Lot offers an alternative. Instead of fleeing to the hills, he asks to flee instead to a nearby small city. Lot believes he can make it to the nearby city, and there his life would be spared. In verse 21, the angel says to Lot, very well, I'll grant you this favor too. I'll not overthrow the city of which you've spoken. The angels have indeed been gracious to Lot. God's compassion and mercy toward Lot has been on display throughout this entire story. In verses 24 through 26, the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. Because of their sins of inhospitality and the mistreatment of aliens in their midst, God destroys these 2 cities, the plains surrounding the cities, and all its inhabitants and all that grew on the ground therein. Verse 29 restates how God destroyed the cities of the plain, but remembered Abraham. Because God remembered Abraham, Lot and his 2 daughters were saved from the destruction of the cities. It was Abraham's faith that God would do justly that saved Lot. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? This week's lesson continues with the theme of God's faithfulness. This time, God is faithful during grief, but God ultimately answers Hannah's prayer. In the same way Abraham pleaded with God on behalf of Lot and his family, now Hanna pleads with God to answer her prayer for a man-child. Last week we saw how God was faithful to Abraham. This week we see how God is faithful to Hanna and how Hanna honors God for God's faithfulness. The lesson this week is entitled Faithful During Grief, and God Answers Prayer. The scripture text comes from 1 Samuel, the 1st chapter, verses 19 through 20. Verses 9 through 20. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hanna rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall neither drink wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hanna was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. But Hanna answered, No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I've been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time. Then Eli answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant you the petition you've made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hanna, and the Lord remembered her. In due time Hanna conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, "I have asked him of the Lord." So what takes place in this passage? The lesson opens at verse 9. Hanna, along with her husband Elkanah and Elkanah's other wife, Peninnah, are gathered at the temple in Shiloh. After eating and drinking, Hanna arose and presented herself before the Lord to pray. Eli the priest is seated at the temple door. The NISB notes that at this point, Shiloh is the central Israelite shrine which contains the Ark of the Covenant. In verse 10, Hanna is deeply distressed as she prays to the Lord, weeping bitterly. Hanna is a woman without a child in a society that values women who have sons. She weeps bitterly because not only is she childless, but Peninnah, her husband's other wife, is her rival and provokes her severely to irritate her. Dr. Theodore W. Berg writes in the Africana Bible that Hannah's antagonistic rival torments her with vicious barbs and taunts. Hannah's caught in the midst of what could be understood in contemporary street vernacular as baby mama drama. Townsend commentary notes that ancient Eastern legal texts allowed an infertile wife to provide her husband, her maidservant, to bear children for her as his heir. Therefore, the principal wife may possess legal rights to the children of her servants. Now, if you watch The Handmaid's Tale, that sounds familiar. I'll leave that there. But this, however, is not the desire of Hannah's heart. Hanna desires a man-child birthed from her own body. Hannah's distressed. She's distraught. And she is ready for her circumstances in life to change. She's tired of being picked on and talked about. She's tired of being laughed at and scorned. Even though her husband loves her, she's tired of being treated badly about something for which she has no control. She has no child of her own, and there's nothing she can do about it. In the Africana Bible, Dr. Theodore W. Berg explains, Hanna feels the pressure of the high value her society placed on bearing a child, particularly a male, in order to confirm her womanhood. She prays diligently to her God, asking to become pregnant. In verse 11, Hanna makes a vow. She vows to God that if God will remember her with a man-child, she'll give him back to God as a Nazirite until the day of his death. Now, Elkanah loves Hanna, despite the Lord having closed her womb. And now Hanna believes this is something only God can fix. She makes a bargain with God. If only God will bless her with a man-child, she'll give the child back to God as a Nazirite. Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms define vow as that which one has promised, particularly to God or to other persons, that binds one to them. And as much as Hanna wants a child of her own, she promises God she'll return the child. She'll give the child back to God if only God remembers her with this blessing. We can look upon Hannah's vow with compassion and understanding as a powerless woman desperately desiring to change her circumstances. However, there are numerous other uses of vows throughout Scripture that we can look on both favorably and unfavorably. For example, Jonah makes a vow inside the great fish. Jonah 2 verse 9. Jezebel vows to kill Elijah. 1 Kings 19 1 and 2. Jacob vows at Bethel, if God will keep him, then he'll serve God. Genesis 28 20 and 21. And in Acts 23:12, certain Jews vow to kill Paul. But Hannah's vow was specific. Hanna vowed to give God a Nazirite. Westminster defines a Nazirite as a member of a group of Israelites who vowed abstinence from eating or drinking the fruit of the vine, who let their hair grow long, and who sought to avoid contact with dead bodies as a way of expressing their devotion to God. Hannah's child is going to be special. She's going to give her child back to God as a Nazirite. This child will be set apart for service to God, as the rest of 1 Samuel will show how Samuel indeed becomes an iconic servant of God. Hanna, like many parents today, wanted her child to make a difference in the world. Additionally, Dr. Theodore W. Berg explains in the Africana Bible that a Nazirite was a male or female who dedicated him or herself, or who was dedicated to Yahweh by others through specific vows. In verses 12, 13, and 14, Hanna continues praying silently with only her lips moving. Eli the high priest notices her and thinks she's drunk. Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." The NISB notes that Eli's first speech shows his inability, unexpected in a priest, to distinguish between prayer and drunkenness. This raises the question of how effective a leader such an out-of-touch man could be, especially one who is the priest of the nation's most important shrine. Eli was indeed out of touch. He could not distinguish between sincere prayer, the sincere prayer of a powerless woman, and the antics of someone drunk with wine. Perhaps there are ways in our own lives we mistake someone's sincerity for what we see as playful antics. In verses 15 and 16, Hanna sets the record straight. Hanna tells Eli she hasn't been drinking. She's been pouring out her soul before the Lord. She informs Eli that she's been speaking out of great anxiety and vexation all this time. After having set the record straight, verses 17 and 18 show Eli is at least an understanding priest. Now he recognizes Hannah's pain and distress. Now he sees her for the woman she is, and he tells her, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant you the petition you've made to God." So many people have been in Hannah's situation, unable to do anything about their circumstances and knowing only God can work it out. After hearing the man of God tell her to go in peace, her soul is no longer troubled. Hanna has a calm assurance that somehow God is going to work it out. She left her place of prayer, went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and she was no longer sad. Verses 19 and 20 close this lesson, as Hanna and the others rise the next morning, worship God, and then travel back to their homes in Ramah. At some point, Elkanah had sex with Hanna, and the Lord remembered her. Hanna conceives the son she wanted so desperately and names him Samuel. Verse 20 says, she named him Samuel, for she said, I have asked him of the Lord. Hanna gets the answer to her prayers. The birth of Samuel changes her life and her circumstances. So let's give the text some context. Hannah's prayers were answered. She was blessed with the child she so desperately wanted. Her circumstances changed for the better, and she has a happy ending to her story. But sometimes our stories don't end like we thought they should. Life takes us on twists and turns that we would not have chosen on our own. Regardless of the bargains we make or the vows we take with God, our circumstances will be what God purposes for them to be. Sometimes we desperately hang on to any thread of hope that God will hear our prayer and answer for us positively. We rejoice when things work out, but sometimes things don't work out like we thought they should. Beloved, even when things don't work out like we think they should, know that God's love for us is infinite, and what we don't understand now, we'll understand better by and by. Key characters in this text. Of course, Hanna is a key character. She's the mother of Samuel and wife of Elkanah. She prays fervently at the temple in Shiloh for God to relieve her barrenness. Elkanah is a key character. He's the father of Samuel and husband of Hanna. Despite Hannah's barrenness, he confesses and demonstrates his love for Hanna. Eli is another key character. Eli he's the high priest at the temple in Shiloh, also one of the last minor judges. In the latter role, he's said to have served for 40 years. That's a quote from Townsend. Keywords, not necessarily in this text, but good for discussion. One would be vows, or vow or vows. And a vow is that which one has promised, particularly to God or to other persons, that binds one to them. In the Roman Catholic tradition, the entrance into the religious life is marked by vows. Other vows may be made for undertaking specific actions. Another key word is Nazirite. A Nazirite is a member of a group of Israelites who vowed abstinence from eating or drinking the fruit of the vine, who let their hair grow long, and who sought to avoid contact with dead bodies as a way of expressing their devotion to God. Another key term is Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant is the chest carried by the Hebrews that contained the tablets of the law. It was lost from history after the time of Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One would be, let your requests be made known to God. You can see Philippians, the 4th chapter, verse 6. And a second one might be, praying your heart's desire. Questions. One question that you might ask your listeners: why did Hanna want her child to become a Nazirite? A second question might be, God answered Hannah's prayer positively. How should we respond when we see no positive results to our prayer? And then thirdly, did you know that women could take the Nazirite vow in the Old Testament? And then a concluding thought. God answers prayer. Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. And sometimes the answer is not now, maybe later. At any rate, God answers prayer. It's up to us to understand the answer and continue to move forward in God's plan. And a preview of next week's lesson. Next week, the lesson comes from the book of Exodus. We see God's faithful provision for the Israelites in the wilderness. Very soon after departing Egypt, the Israelites face difficult times, and they begin to murmur against Moses and Aaron. When they face hard times in the wilderness, God demonstrates God's faithfulness by miraculously supplying their needs. The lesson is entitled, Bread from Heaven. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real